Hey Lewis, very nice to see you again.
Great to see you, Fabian. Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate you making time for this. To kick us off, would you mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself and professional journey so far?
Sure, the journey has been varied. Out of school, I was bouncing around the Middle East and Canada and the US doing consulting projects, so more on the engineering and business side. But then I had the opportunity to go to a company called the Planix, which dealt with very high-end GNSS inertial componentry. From there, I was lucky enough to get involved into robotics through the Darba Grand Challenge. So that was my first exposure to autonomous vehicles. I was partnered with academic institutions such as Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, etc. Then we began with the commercial implementation of the technology, which involved autonomous mining trucks, those huge vehicles that you see that are about the size of a couple of houses. From there, we were spinning off various technologies. So it became a journey of learning with clients to kind of take that technology and then adapt it to a bunch of other ones. So it was in personnel locations. So there's civilian military applications for that technology. And then building up this localization and perception business and mapping business, because the core function of the company was mapping. That became a journey that was going back and forth through various roles with Trimble and Applanix. Then the opportunity came to move over to Oxa, which is a world leader in autonomous vehicle software. Every day is like going back to graduate school. It's been quite the journey, and it's an amazing company with amazing people. And now we are focused on autonomous vehicle software, adapting them to a bunch of different platforms and solving a lot of customer challenges. And it's been a great ride.
Thank you so much for the overview. Sounds fascinating. Before we sort of delve into some of the nuts and bolts of that, you mentioned localization and perception there. For anyone who doesn't really work in the space and doesn't know what the terminology stands for, would you mind just giving us a little bit of a context to that and some of the current trends in that space as relates to autonomous vehicles?
Certainly. Yeah. And I will try not to get into a bunch of acronyms and whatnot. So if I do, please forgive me and just ask me to clarify. So localization is essentially where you are. Perception is situational awareness around the vehicle. So to give you an example, at a base level, an autonomous vehicle senses, thinks, and acts, given a defined mission set. In order to complete that mission set, you need to, most importantly, know where you are under all conditions, under all weather conditions. And then from there, you can perceive your surroundings to complete that mission set. So that's what I mean by localization and perception. For the localization part, we do not use, for example, real-time GNSS. That is more for, we can get into it later on, but how we track the vehicles while they're doing the job. Mostly we have these a priori maps, so they're camera and LiDAR based. And then from there, you get the location, and then the perception is a real-time activity where we get the localization from the map, and then we perceive all the cooperative or non-cooperative targets around us to safely complete the mission.
I really appreciate the explanation. Just from sort of the outside perspective, there seem to be a number of different approaches that both manufacturers, but then also autonomous vehicle solutions providers follow. What does the current landscape look like, and what are some of the associated benefits but also challenges of either pathway?
So currently, I mean, you can use real-time means of deriving your localization. So that would primarily be inertial GNSS, but both of them fused together have their own advantages and disadvantages. The number one way that you can get safely from point A to point B is by having, as I said, that a priori map, that built up map. So how an engagement looks like is we would do, let's say, an airport. We would go there ahead of time, map the entire space that we'll be operating in, and then we will take that map, analyze it, and through a series of processes, a number of which are automated, we can generate that map structure and then understand exactly what we're going to be encountering. And that's the best way to localize against.
What role does, of course, everyone is talking, especially in the context of AI and Gen AI, everyone's talking about data. Would you mind giving us a little bit of, and data seems to be quite critical here as well, would you mind giving us a little bit of context to the role data plays in this context and I guess, the infrastructure and solutions that are needed to bring these solutions to life?
In terms of the map, so let's take, for example, the mapping. We will take data from a number of sources, mostly from the vehicle, and then fuse them into, let's say, this composite map, if you will, and then look at all the structures and the area that we're going to be operating in, and then semantically add a number of different features. So, for example, a stoplight, crossway, etc. And then we can go and construct a model of the operating environment so that we can run through it before you actually run through it, so that we can already precede any kind of issues that we may encounter during the actual operational run.
Appreciate the context. Transitioning to the customer and an end user perspective, um, I guess, so from my experience, there seems to be quite a fragmented landscape at the minute where we've still got, as relates to autonomous vehicles, a number of sort of more advanced use cases, especially in the US, some in China. Generally, there's a little bit of a controversial statement, but where regulations in some respects are a little looser, although of course in the US they are also quite careful in terms of local approvals. But what does the sort of current landscape from a use case perspective look like? Where are we most advanced? And then sort of on a broader scale, where do you see the wider population globally? When are they able to unlock some of these more advanced, so speaking of level 3 plus of autonomous driving, to benefit from that?
So I'm going to speak right now from an OXA context where
Yeah.
you don't want to, in these situations, you don't want to boil the ocean, if you want to have that phrase. It's more about finding those hyper local areas and then constructing out how you go from that hyper local, then expand out. So for example, when I mean hyper local, it's, are you operating in a refinery? Are you operating in an airport? Are you operating into a segmented zone where you can have a great sense of what you're doing? We do on-road and off-road. So if you look at the list of applications that we do right now, there are autonomous shuttles, airports in our latest release with DHL. We
Mm.
have asset monitoring for some solar and wind farm applications, and we are also into ports and harbors. So those are all what I would refer to as hyper local scenes. Those hyper local environments allow you to get a good state on how you are going to train the vehicle to operate within those, and then you expand out. So the beauty about universal autonomy and the way we're doing it at OXA is you have these hyper local scenes that you are then kind of expanding out as we go on road, off road. And for the reference autonomy designs that we have, they change based on the vehicle, based on the operating environment. So there are a number of different factors that go into taking it from one place and then go to another. The beauty is that you expand this repository, or as our founder likes to say, and I like the analogy, we're basically constructing a syllabus for all these different scenarios so that you can train a vehicle easier the more data you get.
No, it's fascinating. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So I guess, so from my observation, based on what you just said, there seems to be sort of a number of factors you consider initially, and steps you go through. So I guess initially, in terms of use cases, you call it hyper localized. So generally probably use cases that are quite predictable, where the number of sort of externalities that could disrupt an operation are probably a little bit more limited. But what are some of the factors that you consider in sort of the initial stages of evaluation? And then maybe we'll talk about some further stages in a moment.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we operate in industrial mobility automation. We are, even though the scene is local, or let's say hyper local, there are still things that can happen which are unforeseen, and this is why the training aspect of this is very important. So for example, in our latest work with DHL at London Heathrow Airport, you can map everything, you can do everything you need to do. However, there are going to be, let's say, an ambulance coming. What do you do? Somebody jaywalking across a place where they shouldn't be. What do you do? So those are those hyper local kind of syllabuses, if you will, that you can train ahead of time to go and expand out your use case set. And when you do that, we have this repository of data which then is increasing in terms of experiences and what to do. So you're training the trainer, if you will, on the vehicle to say, as you get more experience in these environments, you put it back into the syllabus, and that syllabus then goes to training other cooperative or adverse scenarios that we will encounter in the real world.
Just practically, maybe taking this example, if that's a suitable one, London Heathrow, where do you start, and how do you sort of scale a use case from and map out sort of the different pathway, if that's a sort of step that you have to go through? I'm just sort of trying to understand what specifically needs to happen to deliver these solutions safely and robustly, given that, I mean, I only develop software predominantly and don't deal with, as McDuffie called them, automobiles, large heavy objects in public space.
There is a very long process of consulting, not only from a safety aspect, but the business aspect, even before we get to a trial with a client. So let's start off with, I mean, you mentioned airports, so let's take that example. We get, what does the client want to get out of that engagement? So we list a number of KPIs that we need to meet. Once we have those KPIs, then I do a deep dive, because my role as the solutions principal here at Oxa is I have to put my engineering hat on, I got to put the legal hat on, I have to put the business hat on. You have to cover everything. And so from an engagement, we have the KPIs, but DHL operate on the property of London Heathrow. So there are exhaustive safety cases that you need to do. You need to prove, and this is the same in the US with regulators, et cetera, that to the regulators, our software needs to be, and again, I'll borrow another phrase from our founder, available, configurable, and explainable. So available, you come with the software that you have. Configurable, there's going to be cases there that probably require modification, so we need to configure it to operate for that route, for that use case, to solve that business challenge for the client. And then explainable, what the vehicle does needs to be 100% transparent to the client and or the regulator to understand why did the vehicle do that in that particular instance, to explain what the behavior is. So once we have a safety case, once we have the business case and everything, then we can go to the mapping phase. That mapping phase then denotes anything from traffic patterns to different obstacles that we need to be aware of, operational conditions, etc. So once we have all of that, we will build up a map. That map gets loaded onto the vehicle, and then it will be programmed to go from point A to point B, and then it executes its mission. So as you can see, like, there are months of work that go into just getting onto that. You also need to train people to operate within that airport environment. That will be the same for any kind of health and safety issues for operating in any client environment. You have to conform to their rules. So all of that upfront work is done, and then we execute the mission.
Two follow-up questions there. Starting with the first one, you mentioned if I remember correctly, a safety and a business case, essentially, for the solution. The safety case, I guess, is reasonably clear, at least to some extent. But around the sort of business case, what are some of the metrics that you usually aim to address?
It really depends on the client. I mean, at the end of the day, the vehicle needs to solve a business challenge that they're encountering. We can get into later on about using GenAI not only to train to complete that mission set, but also the expansive sensor data that we can record and analyze for the client in terms of their business processes. But in terms of, addressing the first part, we were looking at addressing the business case for, let's say, they have X number of runs that they want to do per hour. How much more can we get with autonomy? If there is a labor shortage and they're using semi-skilled instead of fully skilled personnel because those roles are difficult to find, can the vehicle make an average driver better? Those types of problems that we're solving for.
And then on the sort of second part, around the You mentioned mapping data there and improvement of that. And I was wondering what the sort of, as far as you can talk about it, what does the tech stack behind the sort of solution look like?
The tech stack, what I can comment on is it's expansive. It's what I will share is for because it has gotten a lot of awareness. The latest one that we did with DHL at Heathrow, as you can well appreciate, it's a very complex environment with a lot of moving parts. We did not make any modifications to our software. It was essentially come as you are, see how it performs. You do testing in the background to understand what the vehicle will do in that environment, given the types of vehicles, the relative velocity of the vehicles, the weather states, because obviously it's an all-weather day-night operation. Those runs that the 1,325 kilometers that we were able to perform in the 2-week time span were done in inclement weather, day night. We also had 2 storms, I believe, in Britain blow through. One of them was Storm Bert. We did not suspend operations. We did full shifts.
Sounds about right. It's quite windy here right now as well, so hopefully it's not causing too much trouble to the operations on there. But yeah, on a more serious note, you alluded to GenAI there briefly. What are some of the implications, use cases, benefits of GenAI in your world?
So we can take any number of examples. It's about what's the old adage, everybody has a plan until, something happens, right? So Gen AI is what do you do in certain situations? So for example, on a general roadway, you know the rules of the road. You're going to be proceeding along with traffic. Well, that's great. Well, what are you going to do when it's foggy? What are you going to do when it's rainy? What are you going to do if there is a driver that is driving on the wrong side of the road? These are all the issues that we can simulate with Gen AI so that we know, again, coming back to a safety case and being explainable, what the vehicle is going to be doing. So it's not like everything is highly scripted, but there are things that happen in the real world that you can't foresee. This is a way to mitigate that risk and get the answers and to explain how our software deals with those cooperative situations, which are easy, but the more non cooperative ones, which people could be concerned about.
Hmm. Potentially a little bit of a speculative question, so completely understand if you don't wish to comment on that. But where do you sort of see the role of Gen AI transition to in this space? Just from sort of observations, and they were talking about it, I believe, at the CS as well, related to autonomous vehicles. There seem to be a number of sort of different pathways, scenarios, and some suggest that the simulation of our externalities and synthetic training data for AVs becomes a sort of next revolution and unlocks the sort of started working on automotive around about 10 years ago, and it's always been sort of 3 to 4 5 years away full autonomy, and it still seems to be the case. I was just wondering what your perspective on the possibly transformative nature of Gen AI and associated benefit is.
The benefit is every time we take on a new client, we're on this journey of learning with a client. It's not just about the mission set, but also how we're impacting their business. So Gen AI, for me, serves a dual purpose. There's what's happening on the vehicle, so we can foresee what that vehicle behavior is going to be by training it a new syllabus. So if I go from, let's say, an airport to a refinery, the vehicle has never seen a refinery before, right? But we know what the rules of the road are. We know what people look like. We know there's going to be stoplights. We know there's going to be infrastructure. So we're training it to deal with a new set of circumstances and just getting that done quicker. That's the first thing. Offboard, with that sensor data and with the business challenges in terms of an ROI argument that we have to make to our client, we are showing them on this journey of learning where are the other touch points within their business that we can impact through this. So can they use, digital twins that we do for them to plan resources better? Is there a flow issue? Can we optimize certain vehicles in a certain place in a certain time? Is there traffic congestion, let's say at 3 a.m. at the airport that, is, or 3 p.m. at the airport that's really causing problems. How can we actually solve that? These hyper-local scenes, though, they're still very active. There's still stuff going on, right? So, for example, at an airport, there are always improvements happening. So, how are you getting the maps done quicker to get on board the vehicle to deal with potential stoppages from, let's say, airport construction? All these things can be done with GenAI and training that vehicle to say, you haven't seen a bulldozer before or these stop cones in these certain places. How is the vehicle going to act? So it's practicing the runs, more and more so that the vehicle becomes way more elegant in real time when it encounters those situations. It's the speed at which we can get data to the vehicle to complete the mission set defined by the client to generate that ROI. That's what we're here for at the end of the day.
The examples you mentioned, they're really clear. Are there certain industrial business environments where you believe customers could benefit from a solution like this, and potentially maybe also considering some of the sort of somewhat recent technological advancements, but industries or specific use cases that currently aren't using any of these AV technologies?
Some of the ones that I've mentioned, I would go back to, airports and very industrial clients that have very complex operating environments where there are a lot of moving parts, and those moving parts are going to need coordination. You can do a lot of that through GenAI and, scenario expansion on, yes, we've seen X, but what happens if Y happens or Z or whatever? You can go through all those scenarios and then see what the impact of productivity is, what the cost factor is going to be to a client. So there's a number of things that the models that we generate for the navigation of the vehicle or the performance of the vehicle that can be brought to business processes as part of that expanding ROI argument. Every client is different. Some of them are going into, yes, we have this existing workflow, but in 2 years' time, we're going to do this workflow. Can we already be anticipatory to their needs and understand what the impact of our solution is going to be to those other workflows? That's something that's very interesting to me because I've done that kind of work before. And it's interesting when the client and us are learning at the same time. They're kind of looking at what we're bringing to the table, and then the wheels start turning, right? They start coming up with all these excellent ideas, and then we start informing them on, what we can do. And the eyes kind of go wide open saying, oh, we've never seen that before. We've never considered doing that before. Let's try that. And Gen AI can go a long way in showing them a proof of concept trial on what that data done in a particular way can have an impact on their business.
What are the biggest lessons learned from working with clients on these problems over the past 2 years in your current capacity?
That's a good question. Lessons learned is autonomy is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And things have to be done systematically in the right way to be, as I kind of alluded to before, we come with what's available. It's configurable, but at the end of the day, it needs to be explainable. Autonomy is not explainable, and if people don't have the trust in it, they're not going to adopt it. That's why OXA goes through great lengths to we have a lot of safety assurance people. We have a lot of safety documentation that goes into all of these deployments so that we can do it safely, reliably, and efficiently. So sometimes you will get clients saying, yes, I need this to solve this business challenge. Well, the realization is you need to do it in a very systematic way. And I think educating the client more, and making the technology explainable and approachable and trustworthy. We're figuring out better ways to do it all the time. So the biggest challenge is more not technically doing it, but getting all the steps in place to make sure that that vehicle performs as expected, when it's expected, in all different weather. There are a lot of variables that you have to account for. So going to the end, it's kind of bringing that client on that journey and the surprises that come up along the way that you need to come up with better ways of explaining it.
One final question from my side. This is, of course, the GenAI Automotive Podcast. Imagine that you're talking to one of the senior leaders at one of the incumbent automotive manufacturers who is responsible for their autonomous driving technology and implementation. Based on your work in the more, I'm not sure what the right terminology is, more industrial environment, what are some of the key recommendations you would share with them, maybe considering GenAI, but also beyond, if there's anything that you would like to share in terms of key messages?
Key messages to a, sorry, I
To,
didn't
to a
understand.
senior leader responsible for autonomous driving at one of the incumbent automotive manufacturers.
Trust is everything. Explainability is everything. People like us, we touch this every day at a deep technical level, at a business level. So we can sometimes see the world through only our perspective. We have to look at it through like the inverse and kind of look at the end state, who's going to be using this technology, and then work backwards. So you're backwards integrating these arguments of safety, efficiency, ROI, etc. And just looking at the messages that we're putting out there and looking at how we're projecting and explaining what we do on a day-to-day basis in a way that people can understand and have the technology be approachable so that they see the benefits. And that's going to be great for everybody.
Thank you so much for your time today, Louis. It's been a brilliant conversation.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.